I'll share a little bit around who I am and what I'm doing, and we'll do a couple of breakout groups and activities, and I'll talk a little bit around how the software development lifecycle takes place in the enterprise environment. Not just enterprise, but also in the larger open source ecosystem for the Linux operating system. And then we'll have a brief wrap-up and conclusion at the end. Next slide, please. So a little bit around who I am. Next slide. So my name is Justin Flory. I'm originally from the United States, and I've been doing open source for about 10 years now. Last October, in October 2022, I joined Red Hat in their open source program office, or their OSPO, as a community architect for the Fedora Linux project. Fedora is a Linux distribution, and it's the upstream, as we say, for one of Red Hat's most important commercial products, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or RHEL, which you'll hear me talk about a little bit during this talk. In Fedora, though, I work on community initiatives together with Red Hat employees of other companies, and in many cases, just grassroots volunteers who really like the Linux operating system or being a part of the community. I also coordinate events and conferences for Fedora and do a little bit of the budget keeping, too. Before that, from June 2020 to October 2022, I was part of the UNICEF team at the Office of Innovation as an open source technical advisor. And there I worked with UNICEF's Venture Fund as an open source coach, where I guided international startups on how to build an open source product in a community around their work. Before that, I participated in various other open source projects and communities as well. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit more about my Fedora activity specifically. Long before I held my first job, even before I started my undergraduate education, there was Fedora for me. So the definition of what is Fedora is we say that the Fedora project is a community of people working together to build a free and open source software platform and to collaborate and share user-focused solutions that build on that platform. Or in plain English, we make an operating system and we make it easy for you to do useful stuff with it. So I started participating as a contributor to Fedora in 2015. Right around when I received my high school diploma. I attended our contributor conference for Fedora called Flock in 2015 in New York, and coincidentally it was scheduled the week before I was about to move up there to start my undergraduate education. So since then, Fedora has always been a part of me and what I do in open source. I've contributed to various parts of the Fedora community, mostly in a non-engineering capacity. So the pictures shown here are various photos from when I would represent Fedora as an ambassador or an advocate at events and conferences or go to hackathons across the United States. And after 7 years of being a volunteer contributor, I was lucky enough to actually land the full-time job at Red Hat, getting to work on Fedora all the time, every day. So the part that makes my job so amazing is the wonderful people that I get to work with. Some of them are my colleagues at Red Hat. Said others of them are in other places or they're volunteers. But because that community is so diverse and spread out all over the world, Fedora was one of the earliest things that I got involved with in my career that shaped my future perspective and career outlook. And I also made a lot of amazing friends along the way. Next slide, please. All right, so our first warm-up activity for today. So we are a bigger group, so we are going to have to do some smaller groups. We don't have a chance for everyone to do it in one large group. So next slide, please. So what we're going to do in a cluster of people, try to find a group of either the person next to you or a group of 4. We're going to have get to know each other in your audience. So your name, how you prefer to be called, where you're originally from, and where you're living now, and in one sentence, like why did you show up here? What are you interested to learn or know more about from this session? We'll just take a couple minutes. You can turn amongst yourselves for a little bit and get to know who else is around you. We'll just take 5 minutes for this. All right, we'll take another 1 or 2 minutes, start to wrap up your conversations, and we'll come back in just a second. All right, we're going to go ahead and start bringing it back to the stage. You can, if you have your headphones, if you can let the folks around you know. I don't want to shout and make you go deaf. You can tap your neighbors and let them know we're going to come back to the main stage now. Awesome. I hope that helps to get to know some of the other folks here in the room, what you're interested in this talk. I would have really liked to know what you were interested to know about this talk, but hopefully I'll be able to answer some of those things as we're going through this presentation and the workshop today, too. Next slide, please. So we are actually going to jump right back into another activity after I give you a quick primer. So you can stick with the same group of people you just got to know in the introductions for this next one. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of information, just a little bit, and then I'm going to ask you to put certain things into a logical order in your group. And we'll have some of you share what order you put things into and why at the end of the activity. Next slide, please. So here's the primer. And pay attention. You might be quizzed on this in a moment. So how does a user get software in an operating system, especially like the Linux ecosystem? So one common way that people contribute to a Linux distribution, or we call them distros often for short, is by packaging software so that users of the operating system are able to install it and use it. No one has to go and compile the software and configure it themselves. It's all readily available. So that's the kind of work that software packagers do in Linux distributions. And so, like I said, packaging in this case, this just means compiling, building, and distributing the software in some format that's easily installed by an end user. A contributor who submits software packages to a Linux distribution is called a packager. Easy enough. And a Fedora Linux packagers compile and build the software by writing in what's called an RPM spec file. And then they often submit their spec file for a peer review to other packagers who give them feedback or critique their review or their package if it's according to the guidelines of the distro. And then once a package is approved, it gets to peer review, it is officially added and mirrored in globally distributed software repositories. Hope you got all that. Next slide, please. So now we're going to go back into the groups that you were just in. And what we're going to do is for 10 minutes, you're going to be doing these 3 steps. We'll break back into your groups. And then the only thing I'm going to tell you is the starting and the end point. So what we're going to start from is you have the source code on a hosting platform, GitHub, GitLab, whatever else. So you got the source code, and then the end result is the user using the, we're going to do I think a desktop app here. Yeah, so you have a desktop application. So how you get from the source code being on GitHub to the end user being able to install the app from their operating system, like the web store, the software store. So I've put here on the bottom, in random order, the 5 things that we're going to look at. And this is what you're going to have to order in your groups is documentation about new features in the desktop app, the Fedora Linux operating system, or on your personal or work computer. Then third, the Fedora Linux software repositories that are on the public internet. Fourth, marketing a new release and features added in the release, so a marketing angle. And last, the RPM spec file for a desktop app. This could be Discord, Slack, or your favorite app here. So that was not in order, even though I gave you numbers. That was not in order. So now your task for the next, we'll go, so it's 10:58 now. We'll go to 11:05. So we'll give it about 6 minutes in your groups to talk amongst yourselves and think around how would you order these things? What's the steps, like the process you would go through if you were trying to get from that GitHub repo to the end user installing it on their computer? How would you order these things? So take the next 5 or 6 minutes in your groups, talk amongst yourselves, and then at the end we'll have a brief share out and we'll hear how people ordered it. I will also walk around. If you have any questions, just raise your hand. You. Tyler, how do you build and install the software? It's like the instructions that tells the operating system where should I put all the files. Does that answer the question? Q&A. Perfect. We'll have some, yeah, with a share out. We are going to get into the last minute here, so start to wrap up your conversations. All right, we're going to start winding down the conversation, coming back in. If you have the headphones on, if you would tap your neighbor and let them know, we're going to start bringing it back into the main stage. Start to wrap up your conversation. All right, coming back to the main stage. So we have a lot of us. We won't be able to hear from every group here, but we'll take 3 groups who want to share a little bit on what the order was that you put things in. And other questions I'd be curious to know is, did you and your group immediately agree on an order? Were you all on alignment from the very beginning? And what surprised you about how others ordered or prioritized this list? And what did you see or hear from other groups that may have stuck with you? So we're going to take time for 3. And I'm also going to give you a preface. A secret here, there's actually not one right answer. So there are many ways you could actually order these things. Just to give you a little pressure, I'm not going to hold you right or wrong here. So we can take 3 groups. If there's a spokesperson for 3 groups that we could take, and we have a mic that's floating around right here. I think we have 1, we'll do 2, and we'll go from this side, 3. So we'll start right here, number 1. If we can bring the mic over here. It's coming right up here in the front row.
Oh. Oh. Okay. So we have Aguadev here. So we kind of.
All right. So how did you order it? What order did you put things in?
Okay. So the first one is Fedora Linux software repo on the
The operating system
on the public internet,
on a
and then we have then you download to Fedora Linux OS on your personal work computer, and then the RPM spec file. That's the third one, and then we have the documentation about new features in the desktop app, marketing a new release, and features added in the release is the last step.
Excellent. Your group all agree? You're all like perfectly synced. Nice.
I have
Sure. We'll take a quick question.
quick question. Sorry. Can you hear me, Abby? So, my quick question is, for me, I'm a software developer, and I like building cross-platform systems. And some things I do on my system might not work for other systems, for instance. So, given the state of JavaScript, we have various ways to build desktop applications, for instance, using Electrum. So, if I'm going to use Electrum, is it compulsory I use this?
So you can actually package Electron apps.
Why not on my Fedora system? I use Fedora. I'm a star supporter of Fedora and GNOME system. And one thing that Fedora 38 supports now is the flat-top system, where flat-top is the flatpak rather. So that gives me access to releases of any application I use. So if I'm going to do that, like push my stuff to flat-top, am I going to use this?
That's a really great question, and probably one we won't be able to get into in this workshop. because Flatpak, I'm focusing more on like Flatpaks can be built from RPMs, but you can also build them without having that RPM base layer.
Okay.
So you can actually do both these days, and Flatpak is becoming more popular with desktop apps. Today we're just coming in at the basics around RPM, and because it's still kind of the foundation for a lot of the software packages.
Okay.
But it was a great question. If you want to talk with me after,
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
happy to chat more on Flatpak with you. Let's go to our second right there. Let's hear what order did you and your group put all of these into, and any surprises around your conversation.
Good morning, everyone. So we followed the same order as Agbado FC did, and I call myself out because first I went for documentation straight up first, and I realized that that wasn't the right way. That documentation should be the second to the last.
Awesome. And did your group you were all immediately agreed at all, or did you have to discuss? Did you have to like debate it out?
There was a lot of back and forth.
A lot of back and forth. All right. We'll go to our last one, which is right over here, the second row on this side. Were we on another same order, or did you do it in a different order?
Different order.
Different order. All right.
Yeah,
Let's hear
okay.
it.
Our group
Raise the
agreed
mic a little
on-
closer.
Okay.
Perfect.
We agreed on going with the second order. That's first of all, you have your Fedora Linux operating system. Then after that, the third one, which is your software on the Git repository. Then you proceed to the first one, which is documentation about the new features in the desktop app. Then you move on to the fifth one, which is the software packed, that's the RPM packed in the spec file. Then you market the product for other users to download.
Excellent. All right. So now I'll give you the order that I put things in, which isn't the only order. Like I said, there's many ways you could put these. In general, though, the start and end are kind of the same. So in this order, the RPM spec file would be the beginning point. Because that's like the instructions you give to the operating system. How do you compile or build the software? It's Electron. How do you put all the pieces in the right place so the user can open it? After that, I did documentation about new features because I feel like as an engineer, it's always good to document as you do a new release or you're about to package it so when people get it, learn more about it. Then it would go to the Fedora Linux software repository because there was that review process that happened I mentioned in the last slide. Then I said marketing a new release after that. At that point, once it's in the repositories, people can actually start getting it. They can download it and install it on their system. So that makes, to me, a good time to start talking about it and go to social media or your GitHub or your releases. And then lastly, Fedora Linux operating system on your personal or work computer. Because then once you install the package, you have to actually install it on the laptop or the desktop computer. All right, we'll go to the next slide. We'll have to make this a little quick because we don't have a lot of time, and I want to make sure we get to our activity. We can go to the next slide. Perfect. So this is going to be a kind of a lightning talk presentation on what the life cycle of software packages are in the Linux distribution space. Next slide, please. I'm going to start with a brief history lesson here. It goes back to the 1990s. So the Linux project began in 1991, and it was just not even a full operating system. It was just a kernel, which is the part of the operating system that helps the software part talk to the hardware part. Without that, it's just a bunch of silicon and metal, right? So in the 90s, when Linux was just getting started, it was still kind of forming up. So how you installed software and managed all that back then was kind of like this, and I don't know if it makes sense, but in the U.S. we call it the Wild West. It was all kind of crazy and chaotic. Everything is happening all over, and sometimes things break when one package or one software does something that conflicts with another. There's a lot of challenges in those times. People realize that was very hard, so we get to the 2000s, where now we're focusing on, let's just build the software consistently in the same way. So that's where we start to see this rise of build infrastructure, or sometimes called release engineering in a lot of the Linux communities. So we're getting into less hacky scripts and more consistent code and way of installing and managing the software. So we're still growing. Linux is growing momentum at this point, but it's still very much a niche. Microsoft was definitely not a fan of Linux in the early 2000s. But fast forward in the 2010s, now we're seeing, and even today, we're seeing this greater focus on the need to automate, because a lot of this is, we're not in the 90s anymore when it's all super fresh. Linux and the ecosystem has been going for almost 30 years. So now we're seeing the rise of more automation for packagers, or another kind of buzzword in this space is reproducible builds. So you know that if you have the source code and you're installing it on your computer, those two things should align. There's not something being snuck in the middle and meddling with what's happening on your operating system. And so in general, we're kind of in this phase now of seeing this new age of packaging guidelines and processes, not just in Fedora, but I think in a lot of the Linux distributions. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk very briefly, and the Flatpak question is a good one. We're not going to get into that one today, but in general, across the Linux distribution space, there's some variation, but generally everything is in two kinds of formats. You have the Debian software packages, which is from if you're using Debian, Ubuntu, or any of the Ubuntu variants. There's a bunch, Linux Mint. There's a bunch of, well, that might be based on Ubuntu, but that's based on Debian. There's a lot of distributions that are based on Debian as well. Debian, Ubuntu, Mint. And so with Ubuntu, for example, for their packaging policy, they're flexible for proprietary software, and there's a medium barrier of entry to get software into those repositories. With Debian, they have a rule that you can only add free and open source software into the distribution. You can't add any proprietary or closed source software. And there's a high regard for like a standard way of packaging software in Debian. So there's a little bit of a higher barrier to entry. Then on the other family of Linux packaging software, we have RPM, which is what we talked about in that last activity. So this will be things like Fedora, CentOS Stream, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, SUSE, OpenSUSE, Alma Linux, Rocky Linux, and so on. In Fedora, same thing as Debian, that you can only package free and open source software into Fedora by default. You can always install it yourself, but it's not. We don't provide it by default out of the box. And there's a medium barrier to entry to packaging, because you have to do that review process that I mentioned, or you have to do a peer review and work with other contributors. And then CentOS Stream and RHEL, there's something called extra packages for enterprise Linux. I don't think it's super important right now, but if you have questions, I'm always happy to talk more about it. Next slide, please. We're going to go into a little bit on the packaging, what it looks like in the Fedora, CentOS, and RHEL ecosystem for software. So I want to talk a little bit around the upsides and downsides of why would you want to package it. You have these other ways of doing it, or you can just install it yourself. Why is it worth going through this process? Next slide, please. So some of the upsides. Why is it a good idea to package software for Linux? One hand is you get the community factor, which is I think a really big one. You get to actually work closer to your downstream users or people who are running the software on the computer. You get to have more of that interaction level because people are installing the software and reporting bugs in many cases and giving feedback to the Linux packagers or the maintainer community. So if you're involved in the process, you can actually get feedback and get earlier insight based on the bugs that people are reporting to the Linux distro that might not come to your bug tracker. You can also create contribution pathways for engineers to contribute and share feedback on how you actually compile and build software, which is different from how, just doing the engineering or software development. How we package it kind of goes more into the system administration or DevOps area, but you have more opportunities for people to collaborate on how you're building and shipping the software. You also get increased transparency into how the software is actually getting built and distributed, and there are hundreds of public mirrors for the software that goes to Linux repositories all around the world. I don't know how widespread they are, but the main benefit there is you have folks in Latin America and Europe and Asia, probably some places in Africa too with some of the bigger data centers here, where you can get those local caches of packages, which sometimes can be huge. And if you can not have to go all the way to the US for your internet connection or to somewhere in Europe, it makes it a little bit easier for you to go faster. You don't have to have that long connection out to somewhere else. There's also a security angle. I won't talk a ton about what the GPG part is, but in general, when someone builds a software update or a new software package in Fedora, there's actually a cryptographic signature that verifies that yes, like this package is being built from this source code. And this is the build that you're getting on your system matches what was built in the Fedora release infrastructure, release engineering. Next slide, please. I'm going to kind of hurry through this one a little bit, but distribution CI, or continuous integration, I think at a high level here, this one is that you can leverage these Linux distributions, have ways to test their software. Sometimes they even do community, like there's ways for community members to test on and give feedback on an update before it lands in the distro. So you can get that advantage of getting more testing. And if something's broken on, every Fedora user can't use the software, then you'll be able to know that when you're building the package instead of when someone says, hey, this isn't working for me. And there's also a brand building aspect. So packaging your software for Linux, not just for Fedora, but any distro, I think, gives you more exposure to the software. There's more people who can just in one click install your application without having to go through different ways of compiling it or building it or pulling in different dependencies. It's just right there for them. And then also, get some open source street cred, because there's a lot of folks who are engaging in this community, and if you're doing work there, you're getting your name and you're getting more visible in the community. Next slide, please. There are some downsides that are worth mentioning, or might be challenges or constraints. One thing is at the time to release, you're probably going to be adding like 5 days to your release timeline when you're shipping new software, because there is an opportunity for the community to test and update and share feedback before it goes to all the users of the Linux, of Fedora or CentOS. And it also, however, if you do really want the software, there are ways you can get it before it gets in the repository. But generally, before everyone gets it, there's a test period, a test phase. There's also no, freewheeling. There are some packaging guidelines that you are required to follow. That's why there's that peer review process I mentioned earlier. Again, on Apple, so this one there's like the CentOS Stream and Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which are not so fast on releasing new features. They're focused more on stability and security and long-term support. And these ones, there's a little different policies for that one, because you're often building with older developer tools and things that aren't as cutting edge and leading in the space. So if you want to ship your software into an enterprise Linux distro, you might have to take extra steps to do that versus what you do for Fedora. And then lastly, metrics. As of now, it's not possible to count how many times your package gets installed on an operating system. Next slide, please. So we are a little tight on time, or one back, one forward. Perfect. So there's a flow here. I'm just going to summarize this in short. So Fedora Linux, when we talk about upstream and downstream, just get a show of hands. How many of you have heard that term upstream, downstream before? There's just a few of you, I see. Awesome. So what we mean by that is when you have software that gets forked or it's built off of something else, it comes kind of like a flowing river, right? The changes that are going upstream are flowing down the river to all these other projects and dependencies that rely on it. So in the case of these three distros, we're talking Fedora, CentOS Stream, and RHEL. Fedora is as upstream as you get. Fedora is original. Fedora is not based on anything else. It's all its own. And it moves pretty fast on 6-month release cycles. Then there's CentOS Stream, which is kind of the emerging enterprise Linux. So its packages are maybe a little bit more configured or shaped for the enterprise, more security, or maybe slightly older versions if it's not so cutting edge technology. But CentOS Stream still has a rolling release model. So even though the packages are more enterprise grade, it's always moving at a little bit of a faster pace, because how it flows into Red Hat Enterprise Linux is CentOS Stream is always the next release of RHEL. So CentOS Stream, so we're coming up next year will be RHEL, and CentOS Stream will have version 10. So first, CentOS Stream will be version 10, and that's where all the kind of configuration and the packages are going to get built. And once that becomes really stable, then it will become the next Red Hat Enterprise Linux release. So whenever you're packaging software in this ecosystem, even if you're just doing it in Fedora, there's all these opportunities for your software, your tools to get pulled into this much even larger ecosystem. Like Red Hat Enterprise Linux is something, whenever you're using AWS, Google Azure, Google Cloud, and Microsoft Azure, a lot of times they're building Linux that's in some form based on that Red Hat Enterprise Linux if it's not that. So you can get your things into this whole ecosystem just by putting your stuff in Fedora. Next slide, please. We're probably going to use the rest of our time here on this last activity. How would you actually contribute and get involved in this project? From that earlier activity, there were some pieces in marketing and documentation that were there. I've been talking a lot around packaging and kind of that software piece, but there's so many things you can do, as well as software and engineering and packaging. There's a whole world of things that you can do beyond that. Next slide, please. So this is your primer slide, and I know this might be a lot to unpack, so we'll slim it down here before we get to the activity. But just in the Fedora project, this is a kind of a mind map of all the different teams and activities and things that are happening in Fedora. People who are working on different things in the project. So you'll see kind of in the center here, you have the project leadership. On the left side, you have the engineering steering committee, which is kind of the head of all the engineering side of the project. On the right side, we often call in Fedora the non-engineering parts of the project, we call them mindshare, or mindshare activities, or mindshare projects. So we have the mindshare committee, which is kind of the governance head of that side of the project. And we have things from design to community operations and community management. We have a mentored projects with outreachy. There's user Q&A and moderation on our discussion forum, and marketing, websites and applications. There's a whole range of things that are here. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize this one for the next activity. I know it's a lot. Next slide, please. So for the rest of our time that we have here, we're going to you can mix it up a little bit, get to know some other people too, or you can stay in your groups if you feel better that way. There are many ways that you can contribute to Fedora, both engineering and non-engineering. So here's what I'm going to have you do. Break into the small groups, or actually, we are going to do it differently. This time we're actually going to stand up and move to different parts of the room based on which of these topics are interesting to you. So if you're interested in design, we'll do this. We have 6 topics. So we'll do one group in the back, one group in the front, one group in the back, one group in the front, one group in the back, one group in the front. So we'll do packaging, design, additions. So that's actually like the Fedora Linux. You can actually have different flavors or customizations of the operating system. If you want to do astronomy or make music, you can actually customize like the install so that you have all this software for music production or for astronomy on your system. There's content, so press releases, community updates. There's marketing, which is promoting and advocating for Fedora and Linux. There's outreach strategies, and there's user Q&A. So, forum moderation, chat room support, troubleshooting. So we narrowed down that whole mind map into these 6 areas. So think of a little bit on which of these is interesting to you. And then for your group, choose someone who can be a note taker. I don't think we have sticky notes, so you can use a phone, or if you have your own notepad and paper, that's fine too. And then you can also reference the Fedora documentation on docs.fedoraproject.org if you want, but that's not required for this activity. So what you're going to do in your teams is based on the topics, you're going to do the breakouts, and then think around how would you actually land a contribution? Like how would you, if you wanted to work on something like creating a new Linux flavor for Fedora, or you wanted to do UI, UX for Fedora websites and the design end, how do you think your group would do that? What are the steps you'd look for, like start to finish? And you don't have to know the answers here. This is really kind of an exploration activity to think through, like how would you do this in a project like a Linux operating system? So we're going to go ahead and do the breakouts. We're going to get up and move around. And also don't forget to choose a spokesperson for your group. We'll try to do some share outs at the end, even though we'll probably be coming right up on time. So let's go ahead and do this. If you are interested in packaging, you can go to the back side of this section. If you're interested in the design side, you can come to this front section over here. Additions, center in the back. Content, center in the front. Marketing on this side in the back. And if you're interested in user Q&A, this side in the front. One more time is packaging on the back side of this left, well, your right, my left side. Design in front. Linux additions, center back, content, center front, marketing, right back, user Q&A, right front. I'll give you some prompts before we jump in. The arrangements in 10 minutes. Okay. I definitely see some, I think I see some favorites in the room here. So because some of these groups are really big, you can also maybe split into rows or smaller groups in your bigger groups if you're in one of the really large areas. So what we're going to do, we're going to take about 7 or 8 minutes. We got 10 minutes left for the workshop here. So we'll take 7 or 8 minutes, talk amongst yourselves, and think around, like, how would you try to approach this in the distro? I will be walking around. If you have questions or you feel totally lost, just raise your hand, and I will come by, and you can flag me down, and I will help you out. But we'll take, it's 11:29. We'll come back at 11:36. 7 minutes. We'll be right back. wrap the last conversations. For the groups that are in the back, we'll have you guys all move forward back up to the front of the room. If you are sitting in a back row, if you can move yourself up to the front, we'll do the last readout. Make sure your group has a spokesperson as well. All right, start bringing it back up. We're going to start having see how much time. We can have some folks come up on the main stage here too. So I know there's a lot of smaller groups in some of the larger topics, but if we can we'll try to have 6 people come up from each group, and we have one of the handheld microphones for the event staff. We have a handheld, perfect. All right. So if we can have a rep from the design team. We have folks from the design. Anyone that would want to come up on the stage and share a little bit on design? Same for packaging. I know that was a big group, but can we find one person to come up and share a little bit from their group around what the packaging conversation was? Someone from the additions group? Once you've identified a spokesperson, packaging, excellent. We have one for packaging. Do we have someone for design? Do we have someone for content? Anyone user Q&A that we can have as our spokesperson? Marketing. Marketing, we should have someone who's really ready to jump on that one. And additions. 3 minutes? All right, we'll wrap. We'll make this really quick. We're at your design. All right, we got design, we got packaging. We're going to go ahead and start on the stage. We're right at time. If you're one of the groups that's not up here yet, find a spokesperson and send one person up here from your groups. I know it's tough because these are some big groups. All right. So let's start with packaging. So you can answer one or both of these questions. And we get a sound check. Are we good on the handheld? Right? All right. So the questions I have for everyone coming up, you can answer one or both. Try to keep it to 1 or 2 sentences because we're right on time. What issues or problems came up? Or what was a striking idea or something that was really interesting that came up that you might not have thought about before?
Okay, so for my team packaging, we had a sample case study. So in the process of building a music player, we looked at certain things such as picking a distro, checking the code base, seeing what you could improve or add, and also speaking to other teams because you need collaboration, right? And in order to build packages, we chose Fedora as the flavor of the distro, and we decided to go with Flatpak to automatically update the app.
Flatpak emerged again. All right.
Yeah.
Next time I'll have to remember. I'll have to cover that part. Awesome.
So the other issue that arose was more of choosing what to probably contribute to, going through the code base. Those were certain things, and then some of them issues will be more performance. But with us, the distro went was Fedora. That's cool.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for being our packaging spokesperson. We'll do a lightning round here. So the questions again are what issues or problems came up, and what was something or an interesting idea, something that you wouldn't have thought about before?
Okay. Hi everybody. My team was for marketing, and so there were some things that we discussed, and one of the things we discussed was about type of community, and we realized that to market Fedora, the Linux, and all of that, we will have to do a non-dev and a dev community, but it's like a two-in-one community. So because if you're marketing Fedora, some people that are just coming into the tech space or the dev space may not really understand what Linux is all about. So we have to market it in a way that they can understand. Then we talked about ambassadorship, where people are like spokespersons to explain what Fedora Linux does. And then we talked about how to like express um, the Linux aspect being better than the Windows when it comes to the space, when it comes to the updating software, how fast it is. Then we also spoke about the choosing the right audience and presentation ethics. That has to do with when you're presenting to people, people want to listen to you, people want to understand what Fedora is, and also events and collaboration. When you're collaborating with people, like the way Fedora is collaborating with Oscar to speak about this, then the whole event, just making sure that people understand, or like more, this is more like having a one-on-one conversation with the devs and the non-devs. So that's like what we spoke about for marketing.
Thanks for coming up here. Just a round of applause for our packaging and our marketing folks. Awesome. All right, so what's our next group we have?
Content.
Content. All right. So what were some challenges or solutions or interesting things that came up in discussion?
Okay, so while we looked through Fedora Workstation, the question came up, what is Fedora Workstation? How do we get to understand this? And we began to realize that before we get to talk about Fedora, we need to understand what exactly Fedora Workstation was all about. And then we talked about the workstation, how it could help developers, and we tried to see how we could bring other stuff in so that people can be able to draw like a parallel, like two lines and say, okay, this is it, this is it, this is how it works in some other sphere. So we were going to be creating a release document that talked about Fedora. So it's going to be like a headline that gets people to understand that, okay, they can supercharge their creativity with Fedora Workstation. And we also got to talk about like the benefits and how it can help them to make their work much more faster, while also looking at the features that they can easily incorporate into their daily routine as a team. So this was what we looked at. This is what we talked about for the Fedora Workstation.
Excellent. Thanks for coming up. Round of applause for content. Who do we have next?
Alright, I'm representing design. So basically, I think the only issue that came up is understanding that design is not just visualization or all about beauty. So we need to start from researching or first understanding the goal. What do we really want to achieve? Right. Then from there we go into research. From research, we get our feedback and put together on how to implement the experience, right, on Fedora system. Then from there, we know we need to collaborate with the marketing team as well because we need to do some little of branding and a couple of other stuff right there. So we get to understand that design won't just be about visualization. Design is about research and implementation, right? And we need to collaborate with every team or section on the
Great point.
process.
Excellent. Thank you. Round of applause for design.
Editions.
Additions. All right.
All right, so we talked about making a special edition of kind of like a mini Fedora for a wearable device or something like that, something like a micro device and stuff. So we talk about the specifications we need. We need somehow to have I/O in it, like I/O communications, and maybe other sensors. Like we talked about, like since there are smart devices around that can measure heart rate sensors and stuff. Why don't you have a copy of that? Something a kind of functionality that works with Fedora on it. So we talked about it, and we talked about having the specifications laid out. So these are the specifications we need and stuff. Then we'll go ahead to write the documentation on how things are supposed to work and everything. Then we have to start from the starter package. You know what I mean? So when we start from the starter package and stuff like that, we can be able to build up from there. Then we'll create an open source repository where everyone within the group can contribute to it. Then we'll bring it because I think you have to bring it to someone to actually clear it up. So we'll get to the clearance this thing. So when they look at it and they approve
front and everything, then we can now carry it on to like a marketing team or whoever is to like actually spread the word about it, so we can have more people come in and contribute. So that's what we thought about in editions. So that's it. All right, thank you.
Thanks for coming up. Give it up. And fun fact, we actually do have a Fedora IoT edition. It was meant for those kinds of like, maybe where it could be wearables, but lots of other projects like that. Just saying, there's a Fedora IoT edition. And our last group here.
Yeah, I'm representing the user Q&A group.
Q&A.
So we first discovered that we need to support Fedora users, and we searched for places where we can support such users. The first place we discovered was the Ask Fedora forum, which is more like Stack Overflow. So in these places, we can answer users' questions and also ask questions. We also try to streamline those questions and group them into Q&A, so that if anyone has any similar questions, they can just run through the forum and see that that particular question has been answered and you don't need to ask it again. So there are also other forums we're going to use to help Fedora users. That's the RC channel and also the user mailing list. So these forums, we're going to use them to help Fedora users so that their questions are answered on time. Thank you.
Right, thank you. All right, we can go to the last slide and we're going to wrap up. So, well, first, I wanted to can we get a round of applause for the event staff and all of their excellent patience and help with getting everything running today. Thank you for bearing with us with all the technical challenges. And we get a slide change to the last one. Give one last. If not, you can also find all the slides here. Okay, here we go. So you can find me on my socials as well here. Always happy to talk about Fedora Linux and all the things that we talked about today. Also, if you had some notes, feel free to tweet them at me and share them on Twitter. I'd love to see, I know we had so many folks here today, which was awesome. I'd love to see what your groups all were working on and talking about. So thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of OSCA Fest. Thank you. Thanks. I'm so sorry I ran over.
Hi, everyone. Okay. Hi, everyone. Please, let's move to the next hall. But please, let's try to be as orderly as possible because this workshop already started. And please don't forget to drop your headset on your seats. Thank you.